Ned Stark was not yet Lord of Winterfell when the winds of the north told him the chilling stories that would haunt his dreams for years to come. He was young, barely a man grown, and his father, Rickard Stark, still ruled over the ancient seat of House Stark. Winterfell's corridors had always been thick with the hush of old secrets, so thick that it could feel like the stones themselves held their breath in the blackness of night. Torchlight in those corridors flickered off the walls etched with the memories of generations, but there were whispers older still, whispers that found their way into the ears of the curious. In those days, Ned's curiosity was tempered by a sense of duty. Like any son of the North, he carried in his heart a solemn respect for tradition. Yet there were moments when some deeper sense, like a primal call from the snows beyond the wall, seemed to tug at him, urging him to discover more than duty demanded. At times, the old library tower beckoned him, with its shelves weighed down by the dust of ages. Maester Whaleys, gray-haired and stooped, would watch him from the corner of his eye. Each time Ned came to peruse the shelves, the Maester would ensure the boy wasn't delving too deeply into forbidden lore. It wasn't that the library held any explicitly hidden section, but not all knowledge was kindly. Especially in Winterfell, where the past was never truly past, and the unquiet ghosts of history lingered in every draft of cold wind. Yet it was there that Ned first came across hints, barely more than a name, a terror made ephemeral by centuries, of a figure they called the Night's King, or the Night King, depending on which text one read. That name was said to be older than all the great houses, older than the wall itself. One passage claimed he was a Lord Commander of the Night's Watch who had led his sworn brothers into darkness. Another depicted him as a monstrous being, neither living nor dead, a terror from the land of always winter. But the lines were smudged and incomplete. Only fragments remained. They were enough to awaken in young Ned Stark a cautious sense of dread, for even written in half-faded ink, the accounts held uncanny power. He took no immediate action about these discoveries, nor did he speak of them to anyone. Brandon, his elder brother, would have laughed them off as fireside tales to scare children. Lyanna, spirited as she was, might have teased him for letting old stories weigh too heavily on his mind. And Ben-Jen, the youngest, was only just beginning to show interest in anything beyond being a rowdy boy. So Ned kept those stories close, tucked away in the vault of his heart, believing they were but ancient legends. Such was the way of the North. The direwolves howled, winter winds blew, and terrifying tales were told in the mead halls to stave off the darkness of endless nights. Men had done so since the long night, when the sun hid its face for a generation. Everyone knew the White Walkers had once roamed those endless snows, but that was thousands of years ago. The world had moved on, and so Ned tried to move with it. Yet sometimes the quiet force within him, the same sense that taught him how to stand for duty and honor, pricked at him, as if telling him that the present could not fully escape the past. It was an unspoken feeling, like standing on an icy lake and hearing cracks beneath your feet that no one else could hear. He continued to read. He found old ballads composed by wandering singers who traveled to the distant corners of the North, bringing back stories that overlapped in curious ways with those older, dustier tomes. The accounts diverged about certain details, how the Night's King claimed his bride, or how he held the Night Fort as his seat, but they agreed on one thing. The threat he posed had been dire, and only through unity had he been cast down. By men of the Watch, by the King in the North, and by the might of the Children of the Forest, if some variants were to be believed. All of it was reminiscent of the Long Night, a time of near-mythic horrors. If it was real, then what did that mean for the future? The more Ned read, the more unsettled he became. He even found mention of what might be powers beyond the wall, a phrase often repeated, but seldom understood. The library's older texts were heavy with references to unnatural cold, to a great darkness that lay dormant beneath the snow and ice. Some accounts said it could be roused again if men grew too complacent. Others insisted that if the Watch ever failed in its duty, the old terrors would cross the wall once more. Ned set those books aside with trembling hands, telling himself that he had more important matters to attend to. His father had recently summoned him to observe council with the bannermen. Such training was essential for any who might one day become the ruling Stark of Winterfell. Still, the memories clung to him, an icy seed planted in fertile ground. He never spoke of it outright, not even to Maester Whaleys, who had taught him his letters and helped shape his calm, resolute mind. Perhaps Ned feared to appear gullible. Perhaps he feared the possibility that these ancient texts were correct. Stark men took the old tales more seriously than most Southerners, but that did not make them any easier to believe. And so, he shelved those thoughts alongside the dusty tomes and proceeded with his duties. Training in the yard, hawking and riding with his siblings, learning the steps of courtesy that a future lord must master. If ever a stray line from those ancient stories surfaced in his thoughts, like the hush of a voice that would not entirely go silent, he would push it aside. The real world was complicated enough without the ghosts of old nightmares. In truth, the world beyond Winterfell was growing more turbulent with every moon. The Targaryen king, Aerys II, was said to be sinking into madness. The realm whispered of the tensions between the crown prince, Rhaegar, and other great lords. Anxieties were high, but in the north such troubles felt remote. The winds of war, though they sometimes howled across the leagues, had not yet found a foothold in Winterfell. Rickard Stark did what he could to keep the peace and honor old alliances. But fate is often cruel, and it carried Ned far from home sooner than he ever expected. Ned was sent to the Vale to be fostered under Lord Jon Arryn, a man known for his stern sense of honor and unwavering loyalty to the realm. Brandon, as the elder brother and heir, would remain in Winterfell. Lyanna was growing into a woman of fire and grace, a beauty whose smile could ignite hearts, and whose fierce spirit was equal to any sword. Benjen was still a boy finding his place in the family. Ned, suddenly removed from the north, found himself among new landscapes, vast mountains, narrow passes, and rolling fields. The snow he had known all his life seemed gentler in the Vale, as though the winds had lost some of their bite. He bonded with Robert Baratheon, another ward in the Eyrie, and the two young men formed a brotherhood as solid as the stone foundations of the great castle. Together, they hunted and joked, shared triumphs in the training yard, and spoke of the future with the wide-eyed boldness of youth. Yet there were times, especially at night, when Ned would gaze out across the starlit sky and let his mind wander back to Winterfell's hidden lore. He remembered those passages that spoke of a creeping cold that could outlast centuries. The memory felt far away, as though from another life. Sometimes, Robert would clap him on the shoulder, offer him a tankard of ale, and tell him to shake off that gloom. Robert laughed off Ned's seriousness, calling him too solemn by half. Ned, in turn, would smile faintly but never truly explain what weighed on his heart. It was not so simple to speak of half-forgotten legends and the primal fear they could kindle. The swirl of events in the realm accelerated. Whispers of the Mad King's cruelty increased, culminating in horrifying stories about Lord Darklyn of Duskendale and how the king had dealt with that rebellion. The realm's tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Still, for Ned and Robert, life in the Vale continued at its measured pace. Lord Arryn schooled them in matters of governance, the intricacies of feudal alliances, and the responsibilities of leadership. He spoke often of honor and the necessity of standing for what was right, even if it required sacrifice. Both young men took these lessons to heart, though Robert was more quick to speak of glory and victory, while Ned gravitated toward the quiet determination of a man who understood that no oath should ever be taken lightly. Then came the news of Brandon Stark riding to King's Landing, furious over the abduction of Lyanna, who had allegedly been taken by Prince Rhaegar. The realm erupted in shock. The North was outraged. The Riverlands, as Lyanna was promised to Robert Baratheon, also stirred in indignation. Rickard Stark himself traveled south, demanding justice. What happened in the capital was beyond imagining. Lord Rickard and Brandon were executed in a manner so cruel that people whispered Aerys was no longer just a mad king. He was a demon in human skin. Jon Arryn refused the king's demand to give up his wards, Robert and Ned, and thus Robert's rebellion was born. And with that, everything changed. Ned found himself swept along in a current of violence and grief. Brandon and his father were dead, leaving the weight of Winterfell upon Ned's shoulders. Even as he mourned them, He vowed to uphold the honor of his house and the memory of his kin. He fought alongside Robert Baratheon, raising banners from the Vale and reaching out to the north to muster its strength. The old lines of the ancient scrolls that he had read in Winterfell seemed to fade, overshadowed by present horrors. Who had time to ponder the legends of the Night's King when mortal men were butchering each other? When he marched or rode in battle, blood stained his hands, and the cries of the dying filled his ears. The stench of death was everywhere, as brother turned against brother in the name of kings and lords. No, there was no space for old nightmares. Reality was terrible enough. Yet the North remained the North. Winterfell still stood, and the realm beyond the wall remained a silent, icy sentinel. Letters came to Ned from his younger brother, Benjen, detailing how the bannermen gathered at Winterfell, how the Umbers, Boltons, and Mormonts answered the call to arms. The letter's mention of the Night's Watch was brief but caused a flicker of recognition in Ned. Benjen said the Watch had grown worried about strange sightings in the frozen shore area, wildlings telling tales of walking corpses and pale shapes in the night. Benjen dismissed it as wildling superstitions. In the swirling chaos of the rebellion, Ned had little time to dwell on it, but he remembered the lines from old musty books. "Beware when the dead walk, for the living cannot stand their wrath." He had no proof, nothing concrete, but the mention of the dead walking stirred something deep inside him. It felt absurd in the face of a very real war. Even so, the seeds of doubt, once planted, sometimes sprouted in the quiet hours after a battle, when he was too exhausted to sleep. While Robert roared for vengeance and glory, Ned carried a solemn heaviness, an awareness that the world might hold even darker secrets than mad kings and rebellious lords. It was not a certainty, not even a strong suspicion, just a small, gnawing feeling that the horrors of the present might pale before the horrors of the ancient past, should they ever rise again. As the rebellion raged on, Ned became a leader of men. The lords of the North looked to him now. He rode through storms, his breath frosting on his beard. He stood in muddy camps among men who looked at him with trust, because he was a Stark. The king in the North had once cast down the Night's King, if the legends were true. That legacy rested upon Ned's shoulders now. If he listened in the stillness, he could almost hear the echoes of that old victory, resounding through time. Sometimes, he imagined the dead eyes of a king enthroned in ice, staring across centuries, mocking the living who believed him gone. The fancy would vanish in a flurry of orders, logistics, and council meetings. War demanded every ounce of attention. Dreams, even dark ones, were a luxury. His greatest responsibilities arrived in the form of battles and alliances. The war ground onward, savage and relentless. Ned rescued the maiden Ashera Dane from a perilous encounter during the campaign and found himself momentarily enraptured by her beauty and grace. Yet the war gave little time for romance or reflection. Lord Arryn hammered alliances with the Tullis of Riverrun. Ned found himself betrothed to Catelyn Tully, who had once been promised to Brandon. Honor demanded he fulfill that arrangement. There was no place for hesitation. He did what was required of him. In the chaos, memories of dusty tomes describing the Night's King felt as distant as the sky. Then Harrenhal fell to the rebels. The trident bore witness to Prince Rhaegar's defeat at Robert's hands. Blood stained the waters red. The last vestiges of Targaryen power crumbled. King's Landing was sacked by Tywin Lannister's forces. Aerys died by the sword of his own Kingsguard, Jaime Lannister. The war was all but won, but its cost was immeasurable. The bodies of heroes and villains alike fed the crows. Lyanna Stark was found in the Tower of Joy, far away in Dorne, dying in a bed of blood. The sorrow of her loss nearly unmade Ned. He carried her body north, silent in his grief, as Robert was proclaimed king. The realm had been changed forever. Ned Stark returned to Winterfell as its new lord, a newlywed man bearing the weight of sorrow and the promise of a future. But tragedy had scarred him, and he was not the same young man who had once scoured the library for half-remembered myths. He was quiet, even grim, determined to protect his family and his lands from any future calamity. He hung his sword in the great hall and placed his father's name in the crypt beneath the castle. In the candlelit gloom of that crypt, he sometimes thought he heard the echo of old words, referencing a threat beyond the north. But with the war ended, the realm needed rebuilding, needed peace. He told himself the greatest threats were behind them now. The Targaryens had been dethroned. Robert Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne, and Ned Stark would maintain order in the north. Summer was returning, or so it seemed. For a time, he was content to bury the memory of those old texts beneath the duties of ruling his domain. Repairs to Winterfell, forging alliances with local lords, the birth of Robb and then Sansa. These were the joys and tasks of a man with little patience for ephemeral fears. Yet something odd began to occur as the seasons rolled on. News from the Night's Watch became more frequent, often laden with concerns about the thinning of their ranks and the rising boldness of wildlings. Some claimed they had seen whites, corpses that walked in the darkest hours before dawn. Of course, such tales had always circulated. The wildlings themselves spoke of the White Walkers or the others, but the realm at large dismissed them as stories for children. Ned was never one to believe in ghosts without proof, but the memory of those dusty books was a splinter in his mind. He never spoke of it publicly. Yet one evening, after a day of hearing reports from the Watch's new Lord Commander, Jeor Mormont, Ned found himself in the library again. He had not ventured there with such purpose since his boyhood. He walked between the shelves, heart beating with an unaccustomed urgency, as if searching for something he had misplaced long ago. By torchlight, he carefully sought the old volumes he had once read under Maester Whaleys's watchful eye. Many had been moved or replaced. The old Maester had passed on, and Maester Luwin, though kind and learned, had little time to indulge unorthodox hunts through centuries-old scrolls. Eventually, Ned found a few of the same references. Their brittle pages crumbled at the edges, and the script was barely legible in places. Once more, he read of the Night's King, a figure so fearsome and so vile that all records of his true name were said to be erased. Once more, he read how he had committed atrocities at the Night Fort, how he had wed a woman described as having skin as white as the moon and eyes like blue stars. Some said she was not even human, that she had come from beyond the wall. Others suggested she was a sorceress of the darkest sort. But the conclusion was always the same. Together, she and the Night's King had enthralled the Night's Watch, committing abominations and sacrificing to the others, until the King in the north and the King beyond the wall united to destroy him. This time, though, Ned read with new eyes that had witnessed war, betrayal, and unimaginable suffering. He had lost loved ones. He had seen men burn and cities crumble. He knew what cruelty men were capable of. So, he did not dismiss the possibility that worse things might lurk in the shadows beyond men's comprehension. He spent hours there, poring over each reference like a man trying to solve a puzzle whose answer might hold the key to life and death. The flickering torch cast shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of phantoms dancing at the edge of his vision. He tried to piece together a coherent account, but the stories conflicted. Some placed the Night's King centuries after the Long Night. Others suggested he was a figure from before the Age of Heroes. None agreed on how he truly came to power or what exactly he was. But there was an undercurrent that Ned could not ignore: fear. Every account radiated a bone-deep terror of the cold and the dark. Yet if he were to tell anyone of these half-formed fears, he imagined he would be met with pitying smiles or outright dismissals. The realm had bled enough over a war between men. How could it endure the suggestion of a war between the living and the dead? Still, he remembered the letter from Benjen mentioning wildling tales of walking corpses and the old words whispered by the free folk. The White Walkers are never truly gone, and though Ned tried to reassure himself that the Watch had stood for thousands of years and had faced many threats, a small voice in him insisted that the real threat had never truly tested them. For that was the core of the legend. When the others came during the Long Night, they brought devastation on a scale so vast that it was remembered even after 8,000 years. Perhaps the others had just been another name for a savage tribe, or a sickness that turned men pale and mad. Perhaps it was something more. Days turned into weeks. Ned resumed his duties, pushing the old stories back to the recesses of his mind once again. He saw to the harvests, to the training of new guards, to the solving of disputes among his vassals. He tried to focus on the here and now, the tangible aspects of lordship. The realm was at peace under King Robert. Summer seemed to stretch on, warm and bountiful, as if trying to erase the horrors of war. People married, children were born, feasts were held. Life went on, and it was all too easy to let the ancient nightmares lie dormant. After all, the wall still stood, manned by the Black brothers who took no wives and held no lands. Ned sent what supplies and men he could spare, as Starks had done for centuries. The ravens bore polite words of gratitude from Lord Commander Mormont. He nearly allowed himself to forget, but every so often, in the darkest hour before dawn, he would bolt upright in bed, his skin clam, his breath ragged, as though he had heard a whisper on the wind. "You are needed." At times he almost expected to see frost creeping along the stone floor. He would turn to find Caitlin stirring awake beside him, asking if he was unwell. He usually shook his head and said nothing. How could he explain a fear he hardly understood himself? He suspected it was just the burden of lordship, the same guilt and worry that plagued many men of responsibility. But a deeper part of him remembered the lines from those books, the ones that spoke of a darkness that does not die. The same darkness that turned men into wights, that sent cold nightmares to tear at men's souls. Could the Night's King have survived in some form, waiting for a new age to unleash terror? He found no immediate answers. Even if he had, the responsibilities of his station would have required him to remain silent. What was he to do? Gather his men and mount an expedition beyond the wall? That would be a fool's errand, especially in summer. Without clear evidence, he would be ridiculed. The North already respected him, but even respect had limits when tested by something as intangible as an ancient horror. Ned knew that if ever a threat arose, the Night's Watch would send word. Until then, he could only keep his eyes and ears open, trusting that should any sign appear, he would have the wisdom to act. A year passed, then another and another. Robb grew strong, learning to toddle about the courtyard chasing after a wooden sword. Sansa learned her courtesies, while little Arya proved stubborn and willful in ways that mirrored Lyanna's wild spirit. Bran was born, then Rickon. The Starks of the new generation filled Winterfell with laughter and life. Ned found joy in them, a reason to keep the gloom of the unknown at bay. Yet each passing season brought him closer to the time of year he dreaded: winter. He knew better than most how cyclical the seasons were, and how the North must always prepare. With every winter came hardship, starvation for the unprepared, sickness for the weak. But also, Ned feared, winter might open the gates to old evils if the realm was not vigilant. Occasionally, letters arrived from Benjen, now a man of the Night's Watch himself. Benjen's decision to take the Black had surprised many, but Ned respected his brother's choice. In one of those letters, Benjen wrote of rumors circulating among the wildlings. Rumors of something stirring in the far north, a shadow in the cold. Some called it the return of the others. Most Black brothers dismissed it as the rantings of mad crones. Benjen wrote that he, too, was skeptical, but he wanted Ned to be aware. The letter was couched in practical language, focusing on the challenges the Watch faced. Raids by wildlings, supplies wearing thin. But Ned read between the lines and felt that old dread slowly creeping up on him again. He quietly asked Maester Luwin to keep watch for any unusual reports from the northern holds. If he found any correlation that pointed to something beyond wildling threats, Ned wanted to know. Maester Luwin was a learned man, but even he seemed gently dismissive of the legends. He reminded Ned that the Night's Watch had seen no real evidence of White Walkers in recorded history, that if such monsters had ever existed, they had been gone for thousands of years. Ned conceded that was likely so, but he would not cease to be watchful. A part of him still couldn't shake the knowledge that so many accounts said the darkness was never fully vanquished, merely banished and left to slumber. The years continued their march, and Robert's rebellion drifted into the pages of recent history. King Robert grew comfortable on the throne, ruling with a boisterous spirit, though many said his court was rife with intrigue. Ned stayed in the north, content to let the squabbles of the south remain distant. He focused on being a just lord, raising his children, and ensuring the loyalty of his bannermen. Winter occasionally brushed the land, but it was short-lived, and harvests remained decent enough. Peace, if not prosperity, was the norm. The small folk in Winterfell's domain lived without fear of war. Some folks prayed to the old gods, some to the Seven, all hoping that these good times would last. Ned, more than anyone, understood that good times rarely lasted in Westeros. He still remembered the day a traveling bard sang in Winterfell's great hall. The man played a sad tune, singing of the long night and heroes of ancient days. The verses told of Bran the Builder raising the wall, of the last hero venturing into the cold with a handful of companions, only for them to be picked off one by silent, inhuman foes. The bard's voice echoed against the stone, weaving a spell of quiet in the hall. The final verse ended on a note of warning, that the shadows might one day return. As the final note died, the bard lowered his head. The hall remained silent. Ned could see the unease in the eyes of those who listened. It was a reminder of a time when stories of the others still held power. He gave the bard a few coins and a place to sleep for the night. The next morning, the man was gone, leaving a lingering chill in his wake. Ned took a moment after that performance to linger in the godswood. The heart tree stood there, ancient and watchful, its carved face weeping crimson tears. Beneath its gaze, Ned knelt and prayed to the old gods for guidance and for the strength to protect his family. He wondered if the gods had an answer to the threat of the others, or if mortal men were left to face the darkness alone. The soft rustle of leaves in the wind offered no reply. Yet the sense of calm that always found him in the godswood reassured him that, at least for now, Winterfell's ancient presence stood firm. The castle had endured thousands of winters, just as House Stark had. If doom ever came from the far north, Ned prayed Winterfell would be a beacon of resistance. That small comfort didn't entirely soothe his unease. There were nights when Ned dreamed of walking through endless snow, an icy wind cutting through him as if he were naught but a shadow. Figures with glowing blue eyes glided silently in the distance, turning their heads as if they saw him. In these dreams, he reached for a sword, but the blade shattered like fragile glass in his hands. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Never once did he see the Night's King in these dreams, nor hear that name, but he felt a presence beyond the wind, something that looked upon him with malice. When dawn's first light spread across the horizon, he would find himself relief in the warmth, as if the day banished an ancient terror that thrived in the darkness. Yet the daily realities of lordship demanded that he bury these dreams. He attended to matters of justice in the Great Hall. Robberies, boundary disputes, petty crimes. He saw that the granaries were kept stocked and the blacksmith's forges were always burning. If the Night's Watch sent ravens asking for lumber or skilled workers, Ned offered what he could. He heard from Benjen from time to time, and the letters gradually painted a more worrying picture. Mance Rayder had united the wildlings under his banner as a self-styled king beyond the wall. This alone was alarming. Mance had deserted the Watch, but was said to be charismatic, able to bring together warring clans. Benjen expressed worry about what might happen if such a host marched on the wall. In a postscript, he made the same joke he always did. At least these wildlings are all we have to fear. No sign of the others yet. Ned forced a smile reading those words, knowing his brother was trying to lighten the tone. But the hint of real concern behind them was unmistakable. When Ned occasionally shared these letters with Maester Luwin, the old man nodded gravely. A united wildling force is no small matter, he'd say. The Watch will have their work cut out for them. Yet the Maester also seemed certain this threat was still manageable. The wall had stood through worse. Time and again, Ned almost voiced his deeper concerns, almost mentioned that perhaps there was more stirring in the cold darkness. But he would catch himself. Without proof, he had no desire to seem like he was chasing phantoms. He recalled how Robert had dismissed many superstitions in their youth, how even wise Lord Aaron had considered them stories for winter nights by the hearth. So Ned remained silent, except for an occasional private word with Ben-Jen. And in those words, coded in caution, Ned gently urged his brother to remain vigilant. Sometimes Ned wondered if he should speak to Robert, whose friendship he still cherished. But the realm had changed them both. Robert was caught up in the joys and burdens of kingship, the temptations of feasts and tourneys, fathering bastards, and navigating the rocky shoals of marriage with Cersei Lannister. If Ned traveled south just to whisper of ancient legends, Robert would likely laugh or shrug, or tell him to put it from his mind. The king faced enough tangible threats. Unruly lords, a depleted treasury, Targaryen survivors plotting revenge across the narrow sea, though the latter seemed more rumor than reality. Robert Baratheon, for all his brotherly love of Ned, was not the man to lose sleep over bedtime stories. And so, time flowed on as a winding river, and the realm remained mostly at peace. The children grew, and though Ned encouraged them to keep the old ways, he did not burden them with the knowledge that haunted him. He did tell them the old stories of the North, but he presented them as cautionary tales, not immediate threats. He wanted them to understand the responsibilities of being a Stark without instilling fear. To Robb, he taught the weight of command. To Sansa, the importance of courtesy and compassion. To Arya, well, he tried to teach her the ways of ladies, but the girl had a fierce streak. He let her learn the sword under a watchful eye, uneasy yet proud of her determination. Bran climbed everything in sight, dreaming of knights and heroes. Rickon was still too young to worry about anything but playing with the pups of the direwolf litter they had found. Yes, direwolves had returned to the north. That was an omen, some said, a sign of House Stark's enduring spirit. Others took it as a portent that dark times were ahead. Ned sometimes felt torn, not wanting to fill his children's heads with shadows. So he spoke little of the others of the Night King. Even Catelyn, for all her love and loyalty, was a daughter of the South, skeptical of northern superstitions. She sometimes teased Ned for his brooding. He took no offense, though he realized he was alone in his burdens. His father, his brother, and his sister were gone, and he was left to carry the mantle of House Stark. If there was any truth to the nightmares beyond the wall, it was his responsibility to stand firm, no matter how unprepared the world might be. In the quiet hours, he found himself revisiting that question he'd once tried to bury. Could the Night King be more than just a figure of myth? In the oldest accounts, the Night's King was a man, a Lord Commander of the Watch, who had betrayed his vows and nearly plunged the realm into darkness. But other stories implied he was something else, something inhuman that wore the semblance of a man. If it was the latter, could such a being truly die? Could it have been banished or dormant, waiting for another chance at conquest? Some of the books suggested the Night's King had been destroyed outright, body burned so that he could not rise again. Others said he was cast north of the wall, beyond the lands of men. None of the stories provided clarity. Before Robert's rebellion, Ned had been a boy with a few old tomes and a spark of curiosity. That spark remained, tempered by the forging fires of war and tragedy. Now he was a man grown, a lord with a family and a realm to consider. So he watched, quietly, as a man standing guard before a wide, dark field in the middle of the night, uncertain what might come crawling out of it. Each year, the days grew shorter and the nights a fraction longer, as seasons inevitably shifted. He took small comfort in each new raven from Ben-Jen that spoke of nothing more dreadful than the threat of wildlings. Yet the words in those old texts never left him. Years after the rebellion, news of a new problem in the north reached Ned's ears. White Harbor's ships had reported curious ice floes drifting unusually far south, and rumors among sailors told of ghostly lights in the distance, moving across the tundra beyond the wall. The Mormonts of Bear Island mentioned strange howls echoing across the sea at night. Old Nan, the castle's aged storyteller, muttered in the corner by the hearth that the dead were restless. Though everyone else laughed off her tales, Ned listened. She was older than any living soul in Winterfell, and though her mind sometimes wandered, she remembered details that no one else recalled. When he questioned her, she just cackled and called him a solemn boy. "It's coming again, my lord," was all she would say. the snow and the ice and the things that come with them. One day, Ned decided he could no longer remain passive. He wrote a personal letter to Benjen, much longer and more serious than his usual updates. In it, he confided his worries. He wrote of the old texts he'd read, the accounts of the Night's King, the possibility of White Walkers. He asked if Benjen had heard any credible sightings or if there was any real evidence of the dead walking. He admitted this was all speculation, but he needed to know the truth. Ned expected a response that would gently chide him for overthinking. To his surprise, Benjen's reply was cautious. The letter took an unusually long time to arrive, and when it did, its tone was hushed, as though written by a man choosing his words with care. Benjen stated that while he had no definitive proof, more and more rangers were returning with unsettling stories of silent forests, deserted wildling villages, and peculiar tracks in the snow. In the last month alone, 3 rangers had gone missing. Benjen refused to speculate further, but he acknowledged that the watch was on edge. He ended with, "We stand ready if the worst should come. Pray it does not." Ned read and reread those words, his heart pounding. This was no longer just old lore or nightmares. Even if it turned out to be wildlings or some natural phenomenon, the tension in the watch was real. He summoned Maester Luwin and quietly shared the gist of Benjen's letter, omitting the references to the Night's King specifically, focusing on the possibility of something dangerous beyond the wall. Maester Luwin looked concerned, but not frightened. Together, they composed a message to Lord Commander Mormont, offering to send additional supplies and men if needed. Ned also prepared his bannermen discreetly, though he did not mention White Walkers or anything of the sort. He cited the possibility of raids from a united wildling force. That alone was enough to warrant vigilance. Time marched on, and the ravens carried messages back and forth. The watch thanked him for his concern and support. Mormont wrote that while the wildlings were indeed stirring, the worst fears were likely unfounded. He would keep Ned informed of any developments. And so, slowly, life continued. The urgent dread in Ned's heart found a small measure of relief. But the question remained, could the terror from the stories truly be stirring? He did not know. He hoped he would never find out. On a particularly cold morning, with winter's chill creeping into the air, Ned stood on the ramparts of Winterfell and gazed north. The sky was a pale gray, and he could feel the wind cutting across his face. In that moment, he remembered how as a boy, he had scoured the library for any mention of the Night's King. He thought of how those dusty tomes had roused a feeling of dread and fascination in him. Now, after living through Robert's rebellion, after fathering children, after burying friends and family, he found his perspective changed. The weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders, and he wished those old tales would remain tales forever. But something in his bones told him that the world was rarely so merciful. In the Godswood that same day, he knelt beneath the heart tree once more. He placed a hand on the weirwood's trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath his palm. "Keep them safe," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Whether he meant his family, his people, or all the realm, even he was not sure. The old gods did not speak, but in the hush of the Godswood, he felt the timelessness of the North watch over him. The face carved in the weirwood seemed to stare into his soul, emotionless yet all-seeing. It offered neither comfort nor threat, only the silent presence of ages past and ages yet to come. Caitlin found him later, her fur cloak drawn tight against the cold. She touched his arm, asking what troubled him. Ned only shook his head gently. "Winter is coming," he said, echoing the words that were the motto of his house. She nodded, understanding that sometimes that simple phrase carried more weight than any explanation. They walked back to the castle together, hand in hand, their breath visible in the cold air. Ned thought of all the responsibilities he held. As a lord, as a father, and perhaps, should the worst come, as a sentinel against threats older and more fearsome than any living king. He recalled the question that had haunted him for so long. Could Ned Stark have known about the Night King before Robert's rebellion? In truth, he had known only fragments. Hints from old tomes, rumors from beyond the wall, fleeting nightmares that stirred his soul. It was not knowledge in the sense that one knows a sword's steel is cold or that winter's wind can bite. It was a possibility that burned at the edges of his awareness, too vague to grasp firmly, too insistent to forget completely. The rebellious years had distracted him, overshadowed by the war of men, by the madness of a Targaryen king, by the heartbreak of losing family. Yet, in the quiet recesses of his youth, before the storms of war, seeds of suspicion had been sown in his mind. Now he carried that half-knowledge like a hidden scar, aware that the legends of the Night King, if they held any truth at all, were bigger than any single war or kingdom. They were about life and death, darkness and light, the living and whatever lay beyond. And though he was no maester or scholar of lore, he was a man of honor who sensed that one day, the realm might need every ounce of courage and unity it could muster. If that day came, he could only hope his vigilance, and the vigilance of all the North, would be enough. The day eventually wore on, and the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson. The torches were lit in Winterfell's courtyard, and supper was served in the great hall. Ned sat at the high table, a quiet presence as his children chattered about their day. Sansa excitedly spoke of needlework, while Arya sulked about being teased for her archery attempts. Robb boasted about his progress in the training yard, and even Bran contributed a story about climbing the watchtower. Catelyn orchestrated the conversation, ensuring laughter and gentle correction in equal measure. For a moment, Ned found solace in the normalcy of family life. The distant horrors stayed distant. But as the night deepened, and each child was tucked into bed, Ned remained awake in his solar, a single candle flickering by his side. He sipped a cup of mulled wine, letting its warmth steady his nerves. On the table lay an old parchment, the corners curled, ink faded. It bore the sketch of a figure in black armor, eyes glowing an unnatural blue, captioned with a single name in a spidery script, "The Night's King." Ned stared at it, remembering the countless hours he had pored over such accounts, trying to glean fact from fable. He imagined the voice of Maester Whaleys telling him not to let old tales overshadow reason. He imagined Robert's hearty laugh, dismissing any talk of the walking dead. He imagined the silent watch of the heart tree in the Godswood, offering neither contradiction nor reassurance. With a soft sigh, he rolled the parchment up and tucked it away. These worries would not vanish, nor could he share them openly. But if the day ever came when the horns of the watch blew 3 times, for the others, he would be ready as any man could be. He would gather the strength of the North and stand against the night. Because that was who Ned Stark was, a man of the North, a man who bore the blood of the first men, a man bound to ancient oaths and old gods. He might not have known for certain, might never be certain, but he suspected enough to keep vigilant. He rose, dimmed the candle, and looked once more out the window at the cold moon shining upon Winterfell's walls. Far, far away, beyond the Frostfangs and the haunted forest, the wall stood like a silent sentinel. If the darkness ever stirred there, if a presence older than winter itself ever rose, Ned Stark prayed the realm would heed the call in time. His father's generation had faced the horror of a mad king. His own generation had fought a bloody rebellion. The next generation, his children's generation, might face something far worse. He hoped, with every fiber of his being, that it would not come to pass. Yet if it did, he would not shrink from it. One who is bound by honor cannot ignore the truth, even if that truth belongs more to myth than to the comfortable realm of everyday life. The candle flickered again, then sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. He stood there a moment longer, listening to the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth, feeling the gentle weight of the shadows around him. Somewhere in that darkness lay the echoes of an ancient threat. Perhaps it was nothing more than the wind. Perhaps it was the faint whisper of a name that men had tried to erase. The Night King. Closing his eyes, Ned breathed deeply, recalling the stern words of House Stark. Winter is coming. And so too, perhaps, was something else. But for now, he would do what he had always done. Guard his family, protect the North, and remain true to the principles that defined him. Duty, honor, and the unyielding watch against the night. He left the solar, carrying the memory of those half-known things like a blade sheathed at his side. Perhaps it would never need to be drawn. Perhaps the best path was to ensure that it never had to be. As he walked the quiet corridors of Winterfell, he passed through a band of moonlight, and for a fleeting instant, he thought he saw a shape in the corner of his vision, a tall figure with ice-blue eyes. He turned abruptly, hand reaching for the dagger at his belt. Nothing was there, only shadows dancing on the cold stone. With a rueful smile, he shook his head and continued on his way. If the ghosts of old nightmares haunted him, so be it. He would meet them head-on if ever they manifested in flesh or sorcery. That was the duty of a Stark. That was the duty he had borne ever since he first came upon those dusty books and realized that some legends never truly die. Some nights he might lie awake, wondering if he had done the right thing by keeping these fears hidden. Another part of him knew that the realm did not move on rumor. Lord Stark had to be pragmatic, focused on real, pressing threats. And yet, a lingering voice reminded him that often the unseen threat is the most dangerous of all. He could almost hear the scornful laughter of the unliving if, one day, they rose to find the realm unsuspecting. But that was the future, and the future was a realm of ifs. For now, Ned Stark would act upon the only knowledge he possessed. Men must stand ready, for winter would come in its time, and with it, possibly the darkest shadows of the old tales. He would ensure the North remained steadfast, the nights watchmanned and supplied, and his children taught the importance of vigilance. Beyond that, all he could do was wait and watch the horizon. In the morning light, the gloom faded, as it always did. The day began anew with cocks crowing, stable boys running to feed the horses, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out, and the smell of hot bread drifting from the kitchens. Winterfell was alive and vibrant, its granite walls absorbing the warmth of the rising sun. The illusions of night receded, leaving only the tasks of the day. Ned joined his family at the morning meal, greeting them with a subtle smile. Robb asked if they could ride out to inspect the fields. Arya asked if she could try her hand at the bow again. Sansa politely requested permission to visit the September life went on, and he embraced it with quiet resolve. And yet, when a raven from the Night's Watch arrived later that day with routine updates, bandit sightings, supply requests, Ned felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He scanned the message, relief coursing through him when he found no mention of the others or anything unnatural. Perhaps, after all, these were just stories. Perhaps he had let old books and old fears plant an unease in his soul that would never bear fruit. As he stood there with the parchment in hand, though, he caught a glimpse of the library tower through the window. He remembered that young boy he had been, curious and solemn. In that moment, he understood that knowledge, once gained, could never be fully forgotten. Legends were dangerous precisely because they touched on something primal. The fear of the unknown, the fear that what was conquered might rise again. Still, Ned Stark would not let fear rule him. He was the Lord of Winterfell. He had survived war, heartbreak, and loss. He would face whatever came, however dreadful. With that thought, he folded the parchment and tucked it away. He left the solar and made his way to the courtyard, where his son Robb was practicing swordplay with a training partner. The clack of wooden swords against each other echoed through the crisp morning air. Ned watched for a moment, offering pointers. As the sun shone upon them, he wondered if perhaps this was the real meaning of those old tales, to remind men that they must always be ready, always vigilant, always prepared to stand against the cold. In that sense, Ned Stark had known something of the Night King even before Robert's rebellion. He had known the weight of old stories, the echo of ancient evils, and the abiding truth that winter was always on the horizon. And so, in the end, whether he believed entirely or not, he had carried that knowledge like a quiet torch in the darkness, resolved to keep it lit, no matter how faint its glow. Because in the north, where the nights were long and the cold never truly left, even a small flame could be the difference between life and a freezing death. And if that ancient foe ever did return, if the Night King rose from the depths of legend, Ned Stark would stand against him with every breath in his body and every drop of blood in his veins. That was the vow he made before the old gods, and that was the vow he would keep, until winter's final chill claimed them all or was driven back by the unwavering courage of men. Ned Stark rose before the dawn, as he often did, his breath escaping in pale clouds against the last lingering darkness of night. While much of Winterfell still slept, he walked the ramparts to see the faint glow of the coming sunrise. Down in the courtyard, the guards on the night's watch yawned and chafed their hands, cold even under the layers of wool and fur. Ned nodded to them in passing, a silent acknowledgement of their service. He had not slept well, though that was nothing new. Sometimes the dreams that troubled him were fleeting, dissolving upon waking like mist in the morning sun. Other times, they left him with a vague disquiet, as though he had been standing upon the very brink of an immense void. He had never spoken of these dreams to his wife, nor to Maester Luwin. These were not simple nightmares of war. The memory of old stories haunted him, and each dream felt like a whisper from the past. He gazed north, thinking of the wall, so distant that no matter how much he squinted, he could not see beyond Winterfell's outer fields. He pictured it in his mind's eye, recalling the times he had ridden there as a boy with his father, and later as a man to visit his brother. A colossal structure of ice and old magic, the wall always unsettled him. Even in broad daylight, with the Black brothers bantering and the cold wind howling, it felt like standing on the edge of the world. And, in a sense, it was. Beyond that, there lay only endless forest, rugged mountains, and the biting cold of the lands of always winter, the domain of myths, giants, children of the forest, the others, and possibly, if one believed certain legends, a presence that had once been a man, or something wearing a man's shape called the Night's King. Those old texts still lived in Ned's memory, though he rarely spoke of them. A name that might be no more than a corruption of legends from the Age of Heroes, or might be something far more tangible. He recalled how stories claimed that the Night's King had been the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, centuries or millennia ago, who fell under the sway of a pale sorceress from beyond the wall. Together, they committed atrocities, ruling from the Night Fort until the king in the north joined forces with the king beyond the wall to bring them down. Some said that afterwards all records of his name had been destroyed, as though the realm itself wished to blot out the memory of such evil. Others claimed that his spirit lingered, that the others themselves, if they existed, might serve as remnants or allies of that ancient darkness. Ned closed his eyes, recalling how those dusty tomes in Winterfell's library had once fascinated and frightened him. He was older now, with a family, a lordship, and countless responsibilities. The weight of being Lord Stark had tempered his childhood curiosity, and yet that kernel of dread remained. Each time a raven arrived from the wall, he found himself reading every sentence with a tension in his chest, relieved when he saw only mundane concerns. A shortage of men, complaints of restless wildlings, or petty disputes over stolen horses. Anything truly dire would have roiled the Night's Watch into frantic pleas, but thus far, no such pleas had come. He turned from the ramparts, heading back inside. The dawn hush still draped Winterfell, the corridors lit only by torches and the first thin rays of morning. Within the keep, he passed sleeping hounds curled up in warm corners, and a few servants already stirring. He could smell bread baking in distant ovens, an aroma that reminded him that life continued its steady rhythm no matter what old terrors might exist. Long before the rest of the household gathered for breakfast, he stepped into the godswood. The heart tree stood silent, its carved face seeming to watch him with those sorrowful red eyes. He knelt by the black pool, the damp earth cold beneath his knee. As always, the air in the godswood felt different, older, more intimate. He bowed his head and let his silent prayer drift in the crisp air. He prayed for strength, for his family's safety, for the North to endure whatever hardships the future might bring. Then, inevitably, he found himself thinking of the others, of the slim possibility that ancient horrors might stir. He did not form the words aloud, but the fear was there in his thoughts. Please, old gods, if there is something out there, grant me the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to face it. In the hush of the godswood, he heard nothing but the distant wind among the leaves and the soft trickle of water. When he rose, color was creeping into the sky, a pale wash that heralded the coming sun. The day's duties beckoned. He made his way to the great hall, where servants laid out platters of warm bread, boiled eggs, and bacon. Steam rose from the dishes, filling the air with a hearty scent. Gradually, people filtered in. Robb was first, yawning but bright-eyed, hair tousled as he plopped down on a bench near the head of the table. Sansa followed soon after, neat and proper, greeting her father with a polite curtsy. Arya trudged in behind her sister, face scrunched in annoyance at something only she understood. Bran appeared last, bleary from dreaming, while Rickon was still in the nursery with a wet nurse. Catelyn joined them all, wearing a gentle smile, though her gaze flickered across the table to ensure the children behaved themselves. Ned sat and exchanged a few quiet words with Catelyn about the day's schedule. They would receive a delegation of Manderly men from White Harbor to discuss trading pacts. The repairs on the outer walls needed final inspection. Sansa Septa had requested an audience to discuss the girls' progress in her lessons. Arya's presence was requested at her needlework session. Then there was the matter of hearing petitions from minor lords. So many small tasks, all essential in their way. In these moments, Ned might have seemed every inch the dutiful Lord of Winterfell, calm and focused on the daily business of rulership. Only in the private corners of his mind did that other concern linger, a little shard of ice that refused to melt. He watched the children eat, listened to their chatter, interjecting now and then to offer fatherly guidance. Robb spoke about practicing with a real sword that day. Arya tried to hide her interest, shooting him furtive glances as if hoping Ned might allow her to hold a blunted long sword. Ned gave a small shake of his head. He wanted her to learn the proper ways of a lady, yet he could not entirely quash that fierce, wild spirit of hers. He would find a balance as best he could. The entire time, he felt a gentle warmth from his family, a reminder that these joys, these glimpses of normalcy, were what he fought to protect. No matter what lurked beyond the wall, his family came first. The day carried him along its currents. The Manderly envoys arrived with courteous bows, speaking of shipping lanes, harbor expansions, and the potential for increased grain deliveries in winter. Ned weighed their proposals, careful to ensure the North's welfare was not compromised by hasty concessions. He had a firm respect for House Manderly. They were loyal vassals, but they also strove for their own prosperity. Negotiations demanded patience, and the morning stretched into midday. Sunlight fell through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust in the air as the lords and their companions argued details. Finally, they reached a tentative accord to be set in writing by Maester Luwin. That small success behind him, Ned excused himself for a short break. He took a simple meal, bread, cheese, and ale, then moved on to inspect the repairs of the outer walls. The stonemasons and carpenters greeted him with respect. He examined the fortifications, running his hand along newly laid stones. The North's architecture had to withstand brutal winters, so the work was done with painstaking care. While there, he exchanged a few words with the master builder, who spoke of the difficulties of sourcing top-quality stone from certain quarries. Another trifling matter, but it reminded him that ruling was a tapestry woven from countless threads. Thoughts of dire threats nearly vanished amid these mundane tasks. Afternoon found him in the courtyard, watching Robb cross swords with a practice partner. The ring of steel on steel echoed off the stone walls. Nearby, a stable boy led in a new filly, while a servant carried fodder for the hounds. Arya lurked by a pillar, trying to pick up pointers from Robb's lessons. Ned caught her eye, gave her a mild look, and she ducked her head, though the glint in her eyes hinted she would return to watch again. Life in Winterfell moved at a deliberate pace, anchored by an order that Ned cherished. But routine did not banish the unanswered questions that lurked in his heart. Every so often, he imagined that somewhere in the far north, Benjen Stark was ranging through silent forests, hearing only the scrape of wind across snow. In that empty wilderness, the line between rumor and reality could blur. If the others were stirring, if something worse than wildlings existed, how would they know before it was too late? Ned tried to push the thought aside. The wall's rangers were observant, vigilant, If there were real signs, they would send word. He had told himself that many times, yet he could not quite silence the tiny voice within that asked, and if no one returns to send that word? He found himself pacing the courtyard more than usual that day. It was not that he expected news from the watch, but some intuition nagged at him. Late in the afternoon, just as the sky was beginning to darken, a horn sounded from the gatehouse. A raven had arrived. Ned felt his chest tighten. He told himself it was likely a trivial message, but still, he went at once to see the bird. The guards handed him the small scroll and resumed their posts. The raven perched on a wooden rail, ruffling its feathers in the chill. Ned broke the seal and read, "Lord Stark, I send greetings from Castle Black. All is well enough, though we lost 2 rangers in a recent skirmish with wildlings near the Milkwater. They say Mance Raider grows bolder. As for your question about unusual sightings, nothing conclusive. We have heard rumors of shapes in the night and glimpses of pale figures, but so far no proof. We remain watchful. Benjen Stark." Ned exhaled slowly. 2 rangers lost. That was not unusual in the dangerous lands beyond the wall, but it still pained him. He worried for his brother. The rest of the note gave him a mix of relief and lingering unease. Nothing conclusive yet. Rumors, fleeting glimpses. It was exactly the sort of uncertainty that fueled his disquiet. At least it was not an outright alarm, no frantic call for aid. For a moment, he clutched the parchment, a faint tremor in his fingers. Then he tucked it away, returned to the keep, and shared the gist of it with Maester Luwin, who promised to record it in the annals. Ned noticed the Maester's calm expression, no sign of fear, just a mild concern for the watch's losses. Maester Luwin, a practical man, surely believed the others were little more than ancient superstition. Night descended. Dinner in the Great Hall was a cheerful affair, with the Manderley envoys staying on to feast. Minstrels played, and the long tables groaned under plates of roasted boar, carrots and honey, and fish from White Harbor's own fleets. Ned watched his children savor the meal. Arya picked at her plate, occasionally slipping morsels to her direwolf pup under the table. Sansa chatted with a visiting lady about embroidery patterns. Robb and a few squires laughed over half-heard jokes. Even so, Ned's mind was half elsewhere, imagining the black forests that surrounded Castle Black, where men in dark cloaks kept watch by torchlight. He forced himself to join in the festivities. Lord Wyman Manderley's cousin was regaling the crowd with a humorous anecdote, and Ned offered a polite smile. The hall's warmth and torchlight pushed back the gloom. Outside, the stars shone cold in the sky. Perhaps, Ned thought, that was how it would always be. Men gathering in the light, telling stories and feasting, while the darkness pressed against the walls, unseen yet patient. When the guests finally are tired, and the children were sent off to bed, Ned lingered in the hall, sipping a final cup of mulled wine. Catelyn approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, saw the concern in her eyes. "Is something troubling you?" she asked softly. He managed a small smile. "The usual concerns of the North. Wildlings, trade, the Night's Watch. Nothing dire." Catelyn took a seat beside him. "You've worn that solemn face all day. You know you can speak plainly with me." He hesitated. He did not want to burden her with half-formed fears. He loved her, but he also knew she did not share the North's deeper superstitions. "I only worry about Benjen," he said finally. "He's been gone so long with the watch." She nodded, her expression sympathetic. "He chose that life, Ned. He knew the risks." Ned allowed. "But risk becomes real when you see men vanish beyond the wall." Catelyn reached out and touched his hand. "If it troubles you so, perhaps you might ride to the wall. Inspect the situation yourself." He weighed her words. Once, he might have done so without hesitation. But these days, with his children still young, and with constant duties in the North, it was not so simple. Traveling to the wall would take weeks, especially if he wanted to ride beyond it. He would have to entrust Winterfell's governance to his castellans or to Robb, who was still a boy of only 12. "Maybe in time," Ned said softly. But for now, I'll trust Benjen's judgment. He's a Stark of Winterfell. He'll do what's right." She gave him a slight smile, then rose and kissed his brow. "Come to bed soon," she said, her voice gentle. "Morning will come quickly." He watched her leave, her skirts whispering against the floor. Left alone, he finished his wine and allowed his thoughts to wander yet again. The older he grew, the more he realized that knowledge could be as heavy a burden as any chainmail. Knowing that something might be amiss beyond the wall, but having no proof and no easy remedy, was a special kind of torment. Duty compelled him to remain vigilant. Yet what could he do realistically? March an army north on the strength of rumors? That would be madness. The realm would think him paranoid or worse. Eventually, he rose and made his way to the Solar. There, by candlelight, he unrolled a map of the north, studying the white spaces beyond the wall. He traced the path of the Milkwater, the Haunted Forest, the Frostfangs. With a stylus, he marked areas where rangers had reported skirmishes or sightings. So many blank spaces lay beyond the drawn lines, places few Southerners ever cared to contemplate. "This is the land we Starks guard against," he thought. "Thousands of years we have done so. Perhaps all we guard against now is the threat of wildling invasion. But perhaps not." After a time, exhaustion overcame him. He set aside the map, extinguished the candle, and went to his bedchamber. In the faint glow of the hearth's embers, he could just make out Catelyn's form under the blankets. She stirred when he climbed in beside her, and he murmured an apology for waking her. Sleep beckoned, a respite he both desired and feared, for his dreams were seldom gentle. Yet if he was to rise with the dawn and continue his duties, he needed rest. That night brought him no clear nightmares, merely a restless series of flickering images. He saw snow drifting in a silent wood, a raven perched on a branch, and distant shadows weaving through the trees. He dreamed of a tall figure cloaked in dark rags, with eyes that shone like pale moonlight, although the face was obscured. Sometimes the shape seemed to beckon. When Ned tried to speak, his throat constricted, no words escaping. Then, as always, he woke in the darkness, heart pounding. He looked toward the window and saw the first hint of dawn. Another day had come, another day to keep watch. Time slipped by in this manner, days turning into weeks, weeks into months. The business of Winterfell remained constant. Envoys came and went. The blacksmith's bellows roared, forging new weapons for the guard. The farmers planted and harvested. The maester recorded births, deaths, and petty squabbles. Ned oversaw it all with the quiet efficiency that had become his trademark. Only in the privacy of his own mind did the old fear persist, an undercurrent overshadowed by no tangible evidence. Now and again, a raven from Benjen would arrive, bearing cautious tidings. No true sign of the others, his letters might say, but the wildlings speak of dead things in the woods, and always Ned would sigh, fold the letter, and resolve to carry on. It was during one such lull, with winter creeping closer in the turning of the seasons, that news came from the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy had rebelled against King Robert. The crown called upon its loyal lords to quell the uprising. Robert himself rode to war, crushing the Ironborn in a brief but brutal campaign. Ned marched with him, leading the North's forces to invest Moat Cailin and then set sail for the Iron Islands. The roar of battle replaced his quiet dread for a time. Clad in armor, fighting side by side with Robert Baratheon again, Ned was reminded of Robert's rebellion. The clang of steel, the acrid smell of burning ships, the anguished cries of dying men. War was a horror, but also a distraction. At night, when Ned lay in his tent, exhaustion often overcame him so completely that dreams were a distant murmur. They won the war. Balon Greyjoy submitted, and the final blow came when his only surviving son, Theon, was taken as a hostage to ensure his father's good behavior. Ned returned to Winterfell with relief. The moment he crossed the castle's threshold, his children ran to greet him, Sansa and Arya vying for his embrace, Bran clinging to his leg, and even Robb grinning with undisguised joy. Theon Greyjoy walked behind Ned at a respectful distance, an air of wary uncertainty about him. The Ironborn youth would learn the ways of the North, much as Ned had once learned the ways of the Vale. Amid the celebrations of his homecoming, Ned resumed his old routines. He visited the Godswood, spent time with his family, and spoke quietly to Maester Luwin about the state of the realm. Though the war had been relatively short, the cost in lives was not small. Here in the north, they would need to see to the widows, the orphans, and the wounded. Winter might be near, and they had to prepare. It was only after a few days that Ned thought to inquire of the latest news from the Night's Watch. Maester Luwin produced a letter that had arrived in Ned's absence. Ned read it over, brow furrowing. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont wrote that more rangers were disappearing beyond the wall, and Mance Raiders' gathering of wildlings in the Frostfangs was growing. The Watch requested increased support, men, supplies, even ravens. There was no explicit mention of the others, but Mormont's tone was grave. Ned felt that old worry kindle within him once more. By the old gods, how many times must the Watch call for help in vain? The realm always dismissed the free folk as disorganized raiders, but Mance Raider was no ordinary wildling. If he truly meant to lead an army against the wall, the consequences for the North would be dire. Ned set the letter aside and resolved to do his duty. He would send men, 100 if he could spare them, though that might leave the North vulnerable if another crisis arose. He considered how best to explain this need to his bannermen. The war with the Iron Islands had cost them dearly. Still, the words of House Stark rang in his mind. Winter is coming. That motto was more than a warning about snow and cold. It was a reminder that hardship was inevitable, that vigilance was essential. If the Watch needed men, Ned would find a way to provide. He wrote replies to various northern lords, requesting a levy of volunteers for the Watch, or at least encouraging them to send supplies. Then he penned a direct note to Jeor Mormont. Lord Commander, I have returned from the Iron Islands campaign and have read your letter with concern. The North stands ready to support the Night's Watch, as it has always done. Expect a shipment of grain and supplies before the turn of the moon. I will also gather willing men to swell your ranks. Though times are hard, we cannot forget the responsibility we share in defending the realm from threats beyond the wall. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell. He sealed it and sent it by raven that very day. For a brief moment, as the bird flapped into the sky, he found himself recalling the spidery script of those ancient tomes, the ones that spoke of the long night and the fall of the Night's King. Then he turned away, pushing the memory aside. Action was needed, not fearful speculation. The following weeks were busy with the tasks of assembling supplies, ensuring the roads north remained passable, and organizing a small escort to protect the convoys heading to the wall. The lords in Ned's domain responded in varying degrees. Houses like the Umbers and Mormonts gave generously, while others, less wealthy or more cautious, offered token gestures. Even that was better than nothing. Ned dispatched the first convoy under the command of a trusted retainer. They rumbled out of Winterfell's gates with wagons loaded high with grain, salted meats, and warm clothing. After they departed, Ned found himself in the courtyard, watching the dust settle in their wake. Theon Greyjoy leaned against a post nearby, looking bored, while Robb oversaw a group of younger boys practicing archery. The castle bustled as usual, but Ned's thoughts lingered on the far north. He wondered if the Watch would succeed in quelling the wildlings. How large could Mance Raider's following truly be? And if, by some chance, the others were anything more than rumor, would the Watch even recognize the danger before it was too late? He did not speak these concerns aloud, but he found himself glancing toward the library tower. Later that afternoon, once his official duties were done, he climbed the spiral steps to the upper floors. Most of the servants had grown used to his visits, though they still looked somewhat surprised each time the Lord of Winterfell came here on his own. The upper rooms smelled of old parchment, dust, and leather bindings. Light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating rows of shelves. In the hush, Ned moved past treatises on agriculture, genealogies of lesser houses, and records of trade. Eventually, he reached the older volumes. He ran his fingers along the spines, some cracked with age. Maester Luwin had reorganized much of the collection, but certain texts still remained near where Ned remembered them from his youth. He selected one battered tome titled Legends of the North and opened it on a reading table. A swirl of dust rose from the pages. Carefully, he turned the leaves, scanning the cramped script. He found references to the Long Night, the Last Hero, the Children of the Forest. Then came passages describing the Lord Commander who wed a pale maiden, forging a dark reign at the Night Fort. The book named him the Night's King, though it offered contradictory details about how long he ruled or how exactly he was defeated. Ned lingered over the lines that suggested a link between that ancient figure and the cold powers beyond the wall. Some said he was a human twisted by dark sorcery. Others claimed he was an other in human guise or a half-other offspring. Still others dismissed him as a cautionary fable about oathbreakers. None of the accounts agreed, but all carried a tone of dread, describing a cold that sank into men's bones and a darkness that devoured light. One passage concluded, "So was the Night's King cast down, and his name erased from history, lest men remember the depths of his depravity." Ned shut the book, feeling unsettled. He wanted to tell himself it was all fable. Men had many reasons to spin tales, especially in times of terror. Yet the repeated references to a deep, inhuman cold stuck with him. He left the library with his mind abuzz, searching for a rational explanation. If the others were real, and the ancient accounts said they were, then the Night's King could have been a real person, perhaps some mad Lord Commander. But that did not mean such a figure existed now, or that he was waiting to return. Still, the memory of certain lines gave him pause. "The darkness is patient, for it does not live as men do." That night, he dreamed again of a figure standing on the wall, cloaked in swirling snow. The figure turned, eyes glowing with azure fire. Ned reached for a sword, but in the dream, the steel froze in his hand, turning brittle, then shattered. He jerked awake in the darkness of his bedchamber, heart drumming. The dying fire cast flickers across the walls. Caitlin stirred beside him, mumbling in her sleep. Ned wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his brow, steadied his breathing, and stared at the faint glow of embers until he could gather himself enough to drift back into uneasy slumber. As the weeks passed, the first convoy returned from the wall with word of thanks from Lord Commander Mormont. The men spoke of the tensions at Castle Black, rangers venturing out and not returning, wildling scouts spotted near the woods. They heard rumors from some black brothers that the free folk in the Frostfangs were muttering about an even greater enemy, something that stalked them in the night. But these were only second-hand accounts. The men themselves had seen no proof of anything beyond normal wildling threats. Ned listened to their reports in the great hall, his face betraying little emotion. He thanked them for their service, gave them leave to rest, and told them to remain prepared for another journey if needed. A hush fell after they departed, leaving Ned alone with his thoughts. The hall was mostly empty at that hour, just a few servants cleaning up after the midday meal. He realized his fists were clenched. Carefully, he relaxed his hands and exhaled. The free folk were afraid of something, but the free folk were always invoking stories of ice demons to frighten children, or so the Southerners claimed. The difference was that the free folk lived in that harsh wilderness, where survival was a daily struggle, and rumors might hold more truth than comfortable lords cared to admit. Late that afternoon, Robb and Theon sparred with wooden shields and blunted swords in the courtyard. Arya lurked again on the sidelines, while Bran clapped his hands each time Robb landed a good hit. Ned stood by with his arms folded, observing. He wanted to ensure Theon showed proper restraint. Hostage he might be, but also a ward of Winterfell, and it would not do to have him injure Robb. Yet Theon seemed to be in fine spirits, good-natured in his jibes. The crack of wood on wood rang out, echoing off the stone. Ned's gaze drifted across the yard, where stable hands led in newly arrived horses. One of them was a rangy, dark mare with a scar across her flank. He recognized it as a horse belonging to one of his men who served as a scout and messenger. That man, Sten, was prone to traveling the north with an ear for rumors. Seeing him return unexpectedly made Ned curious. He excused himself from the sparring and walked to the stables. Sure enough, Sten was there, brushing the dust off his cloak. The man bowed at the sight of Ned. "My lord," said Sten, "I bring you news from east of Long Lake." Ned beckoned him to continue. Sten spoke of hearing a strange tale near a small fishing village. Some villagers claimed to have found a half-frozen wildling, babbling about the dead walking. The wildling died soon after, apparently from wounds or exposure, but not before raving about blue-eyed corpses and a great darkness. The villagers were frightened, uncertain what to believe, but their fear was real. Ned felt a chill run through him. It was not the first time he had heard such rumors, but each new account seemed to align with older legends. He pressed Sten for details. How reliable are these villagers? Could the wildling have been delirious from cold and hunger? Sten shrugged. "Entirely possible, my lord. These are fearful folk, given to superstition. But they swore the man was sane enough when they found him. It was only at the end that he began raving about the dead. One fisherman swore the man had an unhealed bite, black around the edges, like it was rotting. He died soon after they brought him in." Ned's lips thinned. "Did they burn the body?" I asked. "They said no, my lord. They buried him." Ned closed his eyes for a moment, then let out a breath. The old stories always insisted that corpses must be burned if there was any chance of unnatural cause. But these were simple villagers, likely guided by the faith of the Seven or the old gods, and burying a body was standard. He thanked Sten and told him to rest, instructing him to remain in Winterfell for a time. After the man departed, Ned stood there in the stable, the smell of hay and horse sweat around him, pondering what to do. A single wildling's ravings might prove nothing, yet the pattern of rumors was growing impossible to dismiss outright. An uneasy resolve formed in his mind. The next morning, he met with Maester Luwin, told him of Sten's account, and asked for a fresh letter to be sent to Castle Black. He wanted to know if any rangers had encountered wounded wildlings or found suspicious burials. Luwin dutifully wrote the note, though Ned could see the flicker of puzzlement in the maester's eyes. Luwin likely wondered why Ned persisted in chasing these tales. Nevertheless, he said nothing but encouraging words about the importance of vigilance. Days slipped by, and the hush of winter began to settle upon the land. The nights lengthened, the air turned sharper, and frost glistened on the bare branches in the morning light. Preparations were made within Winterfell to store enough food for the cold months. Robb and Theon spent more time indoors, practicing in the Great Hall or entertaining themselves with board games. Bran complained about being cooped up, eager to climb the towers whenever the weather allowed. Arya sulked each time she was told to attend her sewing lessons, yet brightened when Ned promised her a new archery session come spring. As for Sansa, she seemed content with her reading, her lessons in courtesy, and her daydreams of knights and fair maidens. One chill morning, while Ned was in his solar hearing reports from stewards, a raven arrived with Castle Black's seal. He dismissed the stewards and broke the wax quickly, reading the short lines penned by Jeor Mormont. The Lord Commander thanked Ned for the warning and said he had dispatched rangers to investigate any wildling refugees near Long Lake. There was also mention that Benjen himself would be leading a small party to scout along the northern side of the lake. Ned's gut tightened. He trusted his brother's skill, but each mission beyond the wall seemed like a gamble. Still, Mormont gave no new cause for alarm. "We remain watchful," he wrote in conclusion. "No clear sign of the others or any unnatural threat. I pray it stays that way." Ned placed the parchment aside. A sense of relief mingled with lingering anxiety. No clear sign, that phrase repeated over and over in his mind, like an echo. He walked to the window, gazing out over Winterfell's courtyard, where a thin layer of snow coated the flagstones. The footprints of guards and servants crisscrossed in the powder, ephemeral evidence of constant motion. "No clear sign," he repeated softly. Did that mean no sign at all? Or was it a way of saying they had found slight hints but nothing conclusive? He knew well how men like Mormont, stalwart and proud, might avoir. De-stirring panic unless they were certain. Perhaps that was best. Perhaps not. He continued through the day, burying himself in the realm's tasks, mediating a dispute between House Glover and the woodsman near Deepwood Motte, responding to a request from House Serwyn for more skilled carpenters, and reviewing the state of roads connecting the northern villages. As he worked, he realized that the living realm required constant effort. Even if old evils woke beyond the wall, the daily needs of the North would not simply pause. People would still need justice, protection, and governance. He took a grim satisfaction in performing these duties, reminding himself that this, too, was how one guarded against the cold. A strong, well-ordered North was less vulnerable to chaos, whether it came from men or monsters. When evening settled, Ned dined with his family in relative quiet. A light snowfall drifted past the high windows, and the fire crackled in the hearth. The children chattered softly. Bran excitedly recounted how he had climbed the first keep that afternoon, ignoring the stern warnings of his mother. Arya asked to go riding the next day if the snow didn't grow too deep. Sansa mentioned something about the Septa's new lesson plan. Robb looked pensive, perhaps thinking of his own future responsibilities. Theon, at the far end of the table, occasionally chimed in with a teasing remark. Ned watched them all with a subdued warmth, proud of the bond they were forming, even with Theon. He suspected Theon's heart still lay with the Iron Islands, but the boy had begun to adapt to life in the North. After dinner, Catelyn suggested that Ned join her in reading from the Seven-Pointed Star in the privacy of their chambers. Though Ned did not worship the Seven, he sometimes listened to the readings as a gesture of unity with his wife. Tonight, however, he hesitated. He felt restless. "Go ahead," he told her gently. "I'll come soon. I wish to take a walk first." She studied his face, as though she saw something there. Gently, she touched his cheek. "Don't stay out too long," she said. "It's bitter cold tonight." He nodded, pulling his cloak around his shoulders, and headed into the courtyard. Snow crunched under his boots. The air stung his cheeks. Winterfell's torches burned bright, illuminating the drifting flakes. Guards on the walls clapped their hands for warmth, stamping their feet to keep blood flowing. Ned walked until he reached a small archway leading into the Godswood. Its canopy, mostly bare, seemed almost skeletal in the snowy gloom. In the heart of the Godswood, the weirwood stood like a sentinel. The carved face in the trunk was dusted with snow, the red sap lines giving the impression of tears turned to red ice. Ned approached slowly, inhaling the familiar scent of pine and cold earth. He wondered how many generations of Starks had stood here, wrestling with burdens they could scarcely voice. The hush was absolute, broken only by the distant murmur of a wind brushing the trees. He knelt before the heart tree, resting a hand on the rough bark. The cold bit into his palm. The face stared impassively, ageless and knowing. His own breath plumed white before him. He tried to form a prayer, but found no words. Instead, he simply allowed his mind to settle, the swirl of anxieties about the Watch, the others, and the realm all washing over him. The wind sighed. A faint creaking noise came from somewhere deeper in the Godswood, perhaps a branch weighed down by snow. He felt smaller than ever, a single man in a world haunted by countless mysteries. He recalled a line from an old story. "We look up at the stars and see only the light of 1,000 dead suns." He wondered if the others were like that, ancient powers from a time so distant that men could scarcely comprehend. If they truly existed, how could mortal men stand against them? The thought made him shiver, and not from the cold alone. Yet the Starks had stood for thousands of years, and in that knowledge lay a bedrock of courage. If the others had come before, they had been driven back. If they came again, the North would fight. Eventually, a numbness in his fingers drove him to stand. He offered a final silent plea to the old gods, then made his way back through the trees, footprints crunching in new-fallen snow. He felt calmer, if not reassured. The wall torches guided him back into the courtyard, and from there he climbed the steps to the bedchamber, where warmth awaited him. Catelyn sat by the fire, the seven-pointed star open on her lap, her expression soft with concern when she saw his face. He murmured that the cold air had cleared his head, then joined her. They read quietly for a time, the hiss of the logs in the hearth a comforting lullaby. In the days that followed, the winter skies settled a thick blanket of clouds over the land. Snow fell in earnest, piling against the walls, forcing men to shovel the courtyard daily. Ice formed on the surface of the moat and the small lakes nearby. The King's Road became more difficult to traverse, though traders and messengers still came and went as best they could. Ned oversaw the distribution of extra supplies to nearby villages that were suffering early from the cold. He ordered hunts for game in the Wolfswood to supplement their stores. The routine was full, demanding, leaving little time to brood over intangible horrors. Yet the name lingered in his thoughts. The Night's King, or the Night King, as some texts called him. Had that old foe truly been destroyed? Or had he been banished to the far north? The legends diverged, but all agreed he had been defeated. Still, a vanquished evil could sometimes rise again if given the chance. Certain texts claimed that the others themselves were not destroyed at the end of the long night. Rather, they retreated, awaiting some future winter. Whenever Ned looked at the swirling snow outside Winterfell's walls, he wondered if that winter had arrived. He kept these fears to himself. Even when he wrote to Ben-Jen, his words were carefully measured, inquiring about wildling movements and watch morale, rather than speculating on the others. He did not want to sow panic. He trusted that if the day came when the watch needed all the realm's strength, the horn would blow 3 times, and there would be no doubt. That was how the old stories said it would happen. 1 blast for rangers returning, 2 for wildlings, 3 for the others. No living man had heard that 3rd blast in thousands of years. Some might call it a part of the Watch's tradition of ghost stories. But Ned knew how traditions often clung to a kernel of truth. Winter deepened. The nights stretched longer. Wolves howled in the distance, echoing across the frozen landscape. From time to time, Ned stood at Winterfell's walls, gazing into the blackness, as though expecting to see shapes moving against the snow. He never did, but the hush of the cold nights set his nerves on edge. He remembered war, the clangor of armies, the shrieks of dying horses. Those memories were terrifying in their own way, but they were the terrors of men. The hush of the winter night brought a different fear, that of the unknown, the ancient. When the new moon came and the night was darkest, Ned found himself in the library tower again, sifting through references he had already read, searching for any detail he might have missed. As the candle guttered, he studied an old scroll that recounted a Night's Watch ballad. It mentioned a commander who fell under the spell of a woman, with skin cold as the ice of the white knife and eyes of blue fire. She had enthralled him, turning his men to her service. The text said they performed sacrifices in the Night Fort's depths, calling upon shadows to do their bidding. Eventually, the Starks of that age learned of these atrocities and, with the help of the King beyond the wall, destroyed them. The text ended with a single line. Thus was the false king cast down, his corpse burned, and his name erased from record, that men might forget. Ned closed his eyes. If the corpse was burned, that suggested a final end. Yet that men might forget seemed all too fitting. Men did forget, and if the others had been real, how many centuries would pass before they were once again relegated to mere stories? Perhaps that was the natural course of history. Perhaps ignorance was safer for the realm's peace of mind. But was ignorance truly safer if the threat still lingered? He rubbed his temples, feeling a dull ache behind his eyes. Lore said that House Stark and House Bolton had been bitter rivals in centuries past, that the Boltons once claimed to wear cloaks of flayed Stark skin. Now those tales were half forgotten, overshadowed by present alliances. Time turned horrors into stories, then into legends, then into dust. Could the Night's King be dust as well, or something intangible and waiting? A soft knock at the library door startled him. He turned to see Maester Luwin step in, carrying a small oil lamp. The gray-haired Maester blinked at the sight of Ned poring over old scrolls. "My lord," Luwin said gently, "it's quite late. You should rest. Is there something I can assist with?" Ned exhaled, setting the scroll aside. I was searching for references to the long night. Just a curiosity. Luwin nodded. You're concerned about the rumors from beyond the wall, are you not? He moved closer, placing the lamp on the table. I've recorded many such rumors over the years. They come and go. Wildlings speak of all manner of terrors in the frost. But the watch has endured. I believe we would see solid proof if the others were truly stirring. Ned tapped a finger on the edge of the scroll. I pray you're right, Maester. But these stories, they linger for a reason. Luwin gave him a kindly smile. Men in the north have always respected the old tales. It's part of what sets us apart from the south. But remember, my lord, we have real threats to handle: wildling raids, ensuring the realm's stability. The others, if they ever existed, have not been seen in millennia. Our records, even the oldest, do not confirm a single appearance since the long night. Ned managed a rueful smile. Your counsel is sensible as ever. Luwin inclined his head. Shall I prepare you a sleeping draught? No, thank you, Ned said quietly. I'll manage. I'm nearly done here. With a respectful dip, Luwin departed, leaving Ned alone in the flickering lamplight. Ned remained a while longer, letting the hush settle over him. In time, he rolled up the scroll and stood. Sometimes he envied the Maester's certainty. As a man of logic and scholarship, Luwin saw the world through reasoned eyes. Ned's own perspective was shaped by both logic and the weight of tradition. Ancient vows, old gods, half-remembered nightmares. It was not a question of ignoring reason, but of acknowledging that the realm might hold truths beyond simple explanation. The next morning arrived with unrelenting cold. The courtyard was ankle-deep in snow. Ned oversaw the clearing of paths so the small folk could move about. Smoke rose from chimneys, muffling the air with the scent of burning wood. Horses stamped in the stables, restless from limited exercise. The great hall fires roared day and night, filling the interior with warmth that was a stark contrast to the icy wind outside. In that winter hush, visitors became rarer. Only essential messengers braved the treacherous roads. One such messenger arrived near dusk, wearing the black cloak of the Night's Watch. The man was half frozen by the time he stumbled into the hall. The guards rushed him to the hearth, where he thawed enough to speak. He bore a letter addressed to Ned Stark, sealed by Lord Commander Mormont. As Ned stood by the roaring fire, he cracked the seal and read, Lord Stark, your brother led a small party of rangers to investigate wildling sightings near the western edge of the Frostfangs. They have not returned by the expected date. We are sending out further search parties, but the conditions are harsh. Pray that they are only delayed by weather. As soon as we have word, I shall inform you. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont. Ned's face went pale. He could hear the crackling fire behind him, but a chill burrowed into his very bones. Benjen missing? He knew rangers often returned late from expeditions, but for Benjen specifically to be overdue was more worrisome. His brother was an experienced ranger, too cautious to be caught unawares by mere weather. Ned clenched his jaw, swallowing the dread that rose in his throat. The black-cloaked messenger shifted uneasily. I'm sorry, my lord, he offered. We can hope it's nothing. Some rangers simply get lost or delayed, especially in winter storms. Ned nodded absently. Yes, he murmured. Yes, we must hope. But his heart hammered. He penned a quick reply to Mormont, expressing his concern and urging immediate pursuit. He vowed any help the North could provide, though it was difficult to send men beyond the wall in the dead of winter. That night, Ned paced his chambers for hours, thinking of all the possible reasons for Benjen's delay. Bandits, a fall into a hidden crevasse, an encounter with savage free folk. Any of these were plausible, but an even darker possibility weighed on him. That Benjen had stumbled across something else, something from the realm of nightmares. When dawn came, Ned wore shadows under his eyes. He summoned Maester Luwin and quietly discussed the possibility of mounting a small rescue party. The Maester advised caution. Winter was harsh, and the roads leading to the wall were treacherous. A few men could attempt it, but the risks were great. Ned considered the idea carefully. If the Watch was already sending rangers to search, any extra men from Winterfell might do little more than expose themselves to the same dangers. Still, he felt helpless waiting for word that might never come. He resolved to at least travel to Castle Black himself. If Benjen was missing, he owed it to his brother to be as close as possible to the situation. The notion seized him with an urgency that allowed for no contradiction. When he told Catelyn, she argued against it, pointing out that traveling to the Wall in the heart of winter was perilous, especially for the Lord of Winterfell. But Ned's jaw set in that quiet way she recognized. He promised not to go beyond the Wall, only to meet with Mormont, see what had been done, and offer help. He would travel with a contingent of men, including seasoned riders who knew the winter roads. Catelyn, seeing his determination, eventually relented. "Very well," she said, laying a hand on his arm. "But be careful. The children need their father." "I need my husband." He embraced her gently. "I know," he said. "I will return soon if the gods are good." Preparations were made. Robb looked anxious when told of his father's departure, but Ned assured him it was only temporary. He entrusted Robb, at 14, to watch over Winterfell alongside Maester Luwin and Ser Roderick Castle, the Master-at-Arms. Theon Greyjoy, disappointed not to be included in the journey, muttered that he would have liked to see the Wall. But Ned did not want to risk taking a hostage from the Iron Islands into such uncertain territory. Instead, he selected a handful of loyal Stark retainers, men familiar with the northern roads. They assembled on horseback in the courtyard one icy morning, breath pluming in the cold as their mounts pawed at the snow. Before he left, Ned knelt to embrace his children. Arya clung to him, tears threatening to freeze on her lashes, while Sansa stood with trembling lips, trying to remain composed. Bran blinked solemnly, as if not quite understanding the danger. Rickon, too young to comprehend, fussed at being held back by a servant. Robb stood tall, determined to show the strength of the heir to Winterfell. Ned clasped his son's shoulder. "Keep them safe while I'm gone," Ned said softly. Robb nodded. Then Ned turned to Catelyn, who held his gaze with worry in her eyes. He kissed her brow. "I will send word as soon as I arrive," he promised. She simply nodded, pressing her lips together. He could see the tension in her stance, but knew that she would not make a scene in front of everyone. She would be the Lady of Winterfell, strong and composed, just as he had to be the Lord, steady in his purpose. With that, he and his company rode out of the castle gates, the sound of hooves crunching through snow. The cold wind bit at Ned's cheeks, and he tugged his cloak tighter around him. He cast a final glance back at Winterfell's walls, at the figures of his family watching from the ramparts. Then he faced forward, guiding his horse onto the King's Road, which stretched north through the Wolfswood and all the way to the Wall. The journey was arduous. Snowdrifts in the Wolfswood reached past the horse's knees in places. Frozen branches creaked overhead, and sometimes the wind whistled through the pines, a lonely sound that set the men on edge. They made slow progress, forced to camp early each day to build fires and stave off the bitter cold. At night, wolves howled in the distance, reminding them that the winter wilderness belonged to more than just men. On the second day, they came across a small clearing where the carcass of a stag lay, torn open by some predator. Steam still rose faintly from the entrails, as though it had not been long dead. The men muttered about dire wolves. Ned only nodded, urging them onward. The woods were filled with savage realities. Despite the hardships, they eventually reached the last hearth, seat of House Umber. The Umbers greeted Ned warmly, offering him and his men shelter by their great hearth, which roared with a log as thick as a grown man. Lord Greatjon Umber was away, but his younger kin welcomed Ned. Over a hearty meal of stew and bread, Ned inquired about any news of Benjen Stark or the Watch. The Umbers had heard rumors of missing rangers, but nothing more. They offered to send a few men with Ned for additional support. Grateful, Ned accepted. They stayed one night, then pressed on. Another day's ride north led them to the bleak and windswept lands that lay between Last Hearth and Castle Black. Here, The King's Road turned into a hard-packed trail flanked by stretches of barren snowfield. The wind picked up, swirling snow into their faces. Ned and his men had to lower their heads, pressing forward with grim determination. At times, the road vanished under drifts, forcing them to guess the path. More than once, they risked getting lost. But Ned followed his instincts, recalling the route from past journeys, and eventually they spied the dark outline of the wall looming on the horizon. It rose like a frozen mountain, its sheer face shimmering in the gray daylight. Castle Black crouched at its base, all black stone and timber, dwarfed by the enormity of the ice behind it. The sight still awed Ned, though he had seen it before. A living wonder, a testament to the realm's ancient fears and ancient defenses. Horns sounded from the castle as they approached, and Black brothers came out to greet them, their breath steaming in the cold. Lord Commander Mormont waited in the courtyard, a towering figure clad in thick furs, his grizzled beard now frosted. He clasped Ned's hand in a firm grip. "Lord Stark, you came yourself." Ned dismounted, wincing at the stiffness in his legs. "I had to. My brother is missing." Mormont nodded, concern etched on his weathered face. We've sent rangers, but the storms are fierce. So far, no sign." Ned glanced at the men in black cloaks moving about the yard, their expressions grim. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. "I want to know exactly what happened." Mormont led him inside, toward the warmth of a common hall where a large fire burned. The rest of Ned's men fanned out to stable the horses and find what rest they could. Seated at a rough-hewn table, Mormont poured them both cups of hot mulled wine. Ned sipped gratefully, feeling the heat spread through him. Benjen led 3 rangers, Mormont began. They planned to scout the western edge of the Frostfangs, where reports placed a wildling encampment. They were supposed to return in 10 days, or send a raven if delayed. We received neither. After 14 days, I sent out a larger search party led by Sir Jeremy Ricker. They found no trace, no camp, no bodies, nothing. It's as though they vanished in the snow. Ned felt an ache behind his ribs. Benjen is no fool. He'd leave sign if they were lost or attacked, unless something prevented him. Said Mormont. "We can guess at wildlings, but no group has claimed responsibility. Mance Rayder is mustering his forces, or so we hear, but they seem to be focusing farther north. One of our scouts reported an abandoned wildling village, as if the folk fled abruptly. No sign of a fight." The Lord Commander paused, then added in a lower tone, "I've heard men speak of other possibilities, darker ones." Ned swallowed. "You mean the others?" Mormont shrugged. "That or something akin. I've lived long enough to know we can't dismiss old tales outright. Not here. I've no solid proof, just missing men and frightened rumors. I was hoping your brother would return on his own, laughing at us for worrying. But as the days pass, that hope wanes." Ned set his cup down. "Let me ride out with your men. I want to see for myself." The older man's bushy eyebrows rose. "You'd risk that in this weather?" "I'll not sit idle while my brother's fate remains unknown." Mormont studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "As you wish. We'll send a strong party, but I'll not have us ride to our deaths. If the wildlings are massed somewhere, or if there's something worse out there." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "We'll do our best, but I'll not lose more men than I must." Ned nodded his understanding. That evening, he and Mormont laid plans. They decided to travel along the known ranger routes, searching for tracks or any sign of Benjen's party. The Black brothers had dogs that could pick up scents, though the storms made that difficult. A half-dozen rangers volunteered for the mission, grim-faced men who respected Benjen as a brother. Ned would bring 3 of his own men, all skilled riders. They set out the next day, passing under the colossal shadow of the wall. The tunnel through the ice was a claustrophobic passage, lit by torches that crackled in the bitter cold. On the far side, Ned emerged into the true north, a desolate expanse of snow and pine that stretched to the horizon. The rangers, clad in black cloaks, led the way, pointing out known landmarks. Each man wore heavy furs and carried weapons, though what good steel would do against rumored whites, Ned could not be sure. The wind keened across the open land, stinging their eyes. They followed trails that were more memory than reality, as drifts could hide any path. Now and then, they saw old footprints frozen in ice, but they could not be sure whether these belonged to Benjen's group, wildlings, or other rangers. Hours turned into days. The sky remained a sullen gray. By night, they huddled around feeble fires, the cold creeping under their cloaks. On the third day, they discovered a ruined wildling camp near the edge of a forest. Torn tents, scattered bones, and a half-buried fire pit. The tracks around it were confused, some leading away into deeper snow. The rangers spread out, searching, while Ned dismounted to inspect a tattered scrap of cloth. He held it in his gloved hand, noticing dark stains. Blood, frozen and black. Someone had died here, yet there were no bodies. It was as though the place had been ransacked, but not by men looting for supplies. Ned could feel it, a sense of wrongness. The wind rattled the remains of the tents, like the whisper of dead men. One of the rangers, Dalbridge, waved Ned over. He pointed at a spot where the snow had a faint rust-red tinge. Something was dragged here. He bent and picked up a shred of clothing. Not black, he said, meaning it wasn't from the watch. Wildling fabric. But look at these marks. The man traced grooves in the snow. Talons or claws? Could be a bear, but the pattern is strange. Ned forced himself to remain calm. Any footprints? None that I see. Could be covered by new snow. They pressed on, hearts growing heavier by the moment. No sign of Benjen or his men. By the fifth day, the search party was low on supplies, and the weather was worsening. A fierce wind driving ice crystals into their faces like tiny daggers. They decided to turn back, though it tore at Ned's soul. He wanted to keep searching, but the rangers insisted. Pressing deeper without leads would be folly, risking all their lives. Ned agreed, albeit reluctantly, trusting their seasoned judgment. They retraced their path toward the wall, battered by the relentless storm. At one point, the dogs began to bark furiously at a stand of twisted trees. The men drew swords, scanning the gloom, but after a tense minute, nothing emerged. Perhaps it was just a fox or some half-frozen elk. Still, Ned's heart pounded. He could not shed the feeling that something was watching from the shadows, pale eyes glinting in the swirling snow. At last, they glimpsed the wall's icy silhouette against the horizon, an immense barrier that gave them a measure of relief. The wind whistled around its towering face. Entering the tunnel felt like returning to a fortress of relative safety. The men emerged in Castle Black exhausted, half-frozen, and without the answers Ned had hoped to find. Mormont met them in the courtyard, looking grim. One glance at their empty hands told him enough. Inside the great common hall, they gathered around a fire. Ned's limbs ached with cold, and he could barely speak until he had taken a sip of mulled wine. Mormont rested a massive hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Lord Stark," he said softly. "There's been no other word. Benjen is still missing." Ned closed his eyes. He felt hollow, numb. A corner of his mind whispered that perhaps Benjen had encountered something that mortal words could not describe, something that had claimed him. He pushed the notion aside. "We'll keep looking," he said, though his voice shook slightly. "If he is alive. If he is alive, we'll find him," Mormont finished. "But we must prepare for the worst." They spoke late into the night, exchanging theories. Some suggested that Benjen might have been captured by wildlings. Others feared a snowstorm had buried him. A few rangers cast uneasy glances at each other, as though wanting to mention the others but unwilling to say it aloud. Eventually, the talk died away, replaced by a heavy silence. Ned faced a hard decision. He could remain at Castle Black indefinitely, hoping for a miracle. But the North needed its lord, and Winter's demands were pressing. Mormont assured him that the Watch would continue to send out search parties when the weather allowed. As much as it pained him, Ned realized he could do nothing more here, not without risking his own men's lives. With a heavy heart, he resolved to return to Winterfell. Before departing, he spent a few moments alone on the wall. An elevator of creaking would lifted him and a ranger up the dizzying height. The wind was furious at the top, whipping his cloak around him. He stepped onto the walkway, gazing out across an expanse of white and gray, broken only by the distant dark lines of forests. The cold was beyond anything he knew in Winterfell. It sank into his bones, numbing his face in seconds. He peered west where Benjen had gone. The storm clouds merged with the horizon, forming a barrier of swirling snow. Ned thought of the old stories, the old fears. If the others walked in that wilderness, this vantage gave no hint of their presence, only an unbroken vista of ice and gloom. Benjen, he murmured, voice stolen by the wind. He felt the heartbreak welling within him. Then, in a moment of clarity, he pressed a hand to the icy parapet and whispered a promise. "If you're out there, I won't stop searching." The ranger at his side said nothing, allowing Ned his private grief. After a short time, Ned nodded, signaling he was ready to descend. The creaking elevator bore them back down, and he tried to steady himself for the journey home. They set off the next morning, leaving Castle Black with subdued farewells. The Black brothers saluted respectfully, promising to send word at once if there was any development. Ned and his company traversed the harsh roads again, battered by frigid winds. The men moved with bowed heads, lost in their own thoughts. Ned felt as if he carried a new weight, grief mixed with dread. Something had taken his brother. Whether it was wildlings or a deeper horror, Ned was not certain. His mind drifted back to the question that had haunted him for years. Had the ancient evil truly been vanquished? Now, with Benjen's disappearance, that question felt more urgent than ever. If the others or something akin to them were stirring, then the realm was in mortal peril. But he had no proof. Without proof, the lords of the realm would not heed his warnings. Even Robert, his closest friend, would likely scoff, attributing the disappearance to savage free folk or the hazards of the wilderness. Returning to Winterfell brought him no solace. The children rushed to greet him, and Catelyn embraced him, relief evident on her face. But as soon as she asked if he had found Benjen, and he shook his head, sorrow settled over them like a shroud. Ned sat by the fire that evening, explaining what little he knew. He spared the children the grimmer details, though Arya's keen eyes seemed to suspect more than he said. Robb tried to hide his tears, but Ned could see them glistening. Sansa and Bran grew quiet. Even Rickon sensed the gloom, though he was too young to understand why. Catelyn wept softly when they were alone, grieving for a brother she had come to admire, if only from a distance. Life had to continue, for Winterfell could not afford to stand still. Ned resumed his duties, but each day felt heavier. In the back of his mind, the puzzle of Benjen's fate echoed like a hammer on distant Enville. The old tales whispered, "The dead walk if the others will them too." Could that be Benjen's fate, to walk in death? A spasm of anguish seized Ned whenever he imagined it. He tried to cling to hope that his brother still lived, that he would appear at Castle Black one day with a harrowing tale of survival. Meanwhile, rumors trickled in through messengers and travelers. More villages near the gift reported missing livestock and the occasional disappearance of lone travelers. Some said it was wildlings. Others whispered the old word, whites. Ned tried to gather details, but it was all so fragmentary, overshadowed by the pressing concerns of winter. The North needed leadership in material matters, food, shelter, protection from bandits. He poured himself into meeting these needs, trusting that if the others were truly on the move, the Watch would blow the horn 3 times. That would be the signal for all the North to rally, and he, Eddard Stark, would answer that call. Yet the horn never blew. The ravens from Castle Black spoke mostly of wildling movements, the looming threat of Mance Rayder. No mention of the others beyond rumor. Benjen remained missing. The pain of it dulled over time, becoming an ache that flared whenever Ned looked at the vacant seat at the high table or remembered his brother's grin. He found himself returning often to the Godswood, kneeling beneath the weirwood in silent supplication. No answers came, One late afternoon, after attending to yet another dispute among local farmers, Ned paused by the library tower. He stared at the ancient stone steps winding upward. The memories of those old tomes weighed on him like a phantom presence. He felt no compulsion to read them again. He knew their contents by heart now. The contradictory accounts, the dire warnings, the uncertain fate of the Night's King. Nothing in those pages could tell him if the darkness had risen anew. Nothing could bring Benjen back. He turned away from the tower and strode across the courtyard, the snow crunching underfoot. A few guards nodded to him. He went to check on the training yard, where Theon and Robb were practicing with swords. Arya was nowhere to be seen, likely forced to do needlework. Ned watched Robb parry Theon's thrust, seeing the focus in his son's eyes. For a moment, the possibility of a brighter future glimmered. If only they could maintain peace in the realm. House Stark needed strength if winter brought nightmares to their door. At times, Ned pondered whether to speak with Robert about his worries. The king knew little of the North's superstitions, but he respected Ned's judgment. Yet without solid proof, what could Robert do? Dispatch an army beyond the wall based on half-heard rumors? The realm would be outraged. The Lannisters would sneer. The Tyrells and Martells would see it as a northern folly. No, Ned realized. The burden lay on the Night's Watch and the northern lords to remain vigilant. And he, as the Lord of Winterfell, would do his part quietly, as had so many Starks before him. The seasons turned slowly, as they did in Westeros. Ned watched each day dawn with subdued hope that maybe, at last, a raven would come bearing good news, that Benjen had returned, or that the Watch had found some explanation for the missing Rangers. The truth never arrived. Each letter from Mormont spoke only of continuing efforts, no results, and the growing problem of wildling activity. Mance Rayder had united many clans, and talk of a mass migration rattled the Watch. Some speculated the free folk were fleeing something worse. Ned suppressed a shiver each time he read such lines, remembering how men in crisis often flee a greater threat. If the free folk truly believed something dreadful stirred behind them, they might try to cross the wall in desperation. While all this weighed upon him, the realm beyond the north carried on with different concerns. Robert grew more entangled with his southern lords, dealing with matters of debt, trade, and the remnants of Targaryen sympathizers across the narrow sea. The Greyjoys remained subdued but restive. The Lannisters extended their influence at court. None of that changed the quiet tension in Ned's heart. The question of the others, the question of whether the Night's King was more than a myth, loomed like a storm cloud nobody else believed in. Years passed. The children grew. Robb neared manhood, tall and strong. Sansa blossomed into a graceful young lady, full of southern notions of chivalry and romance. Arya refused to be anything but herself, fierce and willful, practicing with a small wooden sword when she thought no one watched. Bran climbed higher than ever, dreaming of knights and old magic. Rickon was a toddler no more, running around the castle with a pup at his heels. The realm saw partial winters that came and went, though the wise spoke of a longer winter on the horizon. Each time the snows receded, Ned breathed a little easier, even as he reminded himself that truly long winters could last for years. He never forgot Benjen. Some nights he would drift off imagining that his brother might walk through the gates again, thin and weary, but alive. He also remembered the dream of the figure with blue eyes on the wall. Over time, that image became tangled with his grief, manifesting occasionally in nightmares where he saw Benjen, eyes glowing cold, reaching out with hands that were no longer living. Through it all, Ned maintained his stance of quiet vigilance. He strengthened alliances with northern houses, ensuring that if a crisis arose, they could rally. He provided the Watch with what support he could spare: supplies, new recruits from among the criminals of the north, and occasional donations of arms. He listened carefully to rumors, always alert for a hint of the impossible. If an old huntsman mumbled about an uncanny presence in the woods, Ned would discreetly inquire further, though usually it came to nothing. In truth, he had no illusions. If the day came that the others marched in force, it would take more than the north to turn them back. It would require the entire realm. Yet, recalling the last rebellion, the fractious politics of the great houses, Ned could only imagine how difficult it would be to unify them against a threat that most considered mere legend. The realm still buzzed about potential Targaryen pretenders across the sea, or plots hatched in King's Landing. White Walkers and Whites were not on anyone's lips. Still, Ned Stark remembered. He had not only read the old lore. He had walked in the footsteps of vanished rangers, seen the evidence of terror among wildlings, and lost a brother to those same unknowns. In his own quiet way, he prepared for the worst. The moment he sensed a true sign, he would muster the North, call his bannermen, and stand as the Starks had done during the long night. That vow remained unspoken, for to speak it openly would sow fear and confusion. But it guided him like a blade hidden within a scabbard. Sometimes, in the aftermath of a dream, he would slip from bed and stare into the darkness of the bedchamber, seeing only the faintest outline of furniture. Beside him, Catelyn would breathe softly, unaware of the turmoil in his mind. He would recall the words he once read, "The darkness is patient, for it does not live as men do." Those words taunted him, resonating with the hush of midnight. Then he would breathe, slow and measured, until he calmed enough to remind himself that if the darkness came, House Stark would face it. He would face it. Over the years, he occasionally pondered how it had all begun. The boy who snuck into the library tower, sifting through dusty scrolls, half scared by the old legends. Then war and tragedy swept him up, and he returned a man grown, with scars on his heart. Yet those ancient stories had never truly left him. Even as he fathered children, brokered alliances, and served as Warden of the North, the memory of that half-glimpsed name remained. The Night's King said some texts, or the Night King said others. Whether he was truly just a man or something more, whether he lived or perished, remained a mystery. One that Ned Stark suspected would find its resolution if a second long night ever came. There were times he considered confiding in his children, especially Robb, who would succeed him one day, but he decided against it. They were still young, and fear was not a lesson they needed. He taught them caution, fortitude, and compassion. If one day the truth demanded itself, they would learn it in due course. For now, it was enough that they grew into honorable Starks, prepared to safeguard the North with the same quiet strength their ancestors had displayed. If the old evil never resurfaced, then they would be spared from that dread, and Ned would count that as a victory. Yet fate has its own designs. One cold spring, a raven arrived from King's Landing. King Robert Baratheon was riding north with half the court in tow to visit his old friend Eddard Stark in Winterfell. Ned read the message with mingled surprise and apprehension, for Robert did not come north lightly. Perhaps it was just the king's whim, a longing to see the north he had once traversed in rebellion. Or perhaps something else weighed on Robert's mind. Ned Preppa read for the royal visit, instructing the servants to ready rooms, plan feasts, and gather provisions. The children were abuzz with excitement at the thought of a royal court arriving, Sansa especially. Arya wrinkled her nose at the notion of the pomp, but even she was curious. Catelyn saw the note and raised an eyebrow, suspecting Robert might have a proposal for Ned. Possibly a new position at court, possibly an alliance. Neither of them could have guessed the real magnitude of what was about to unfold. In the midst of those arrangements, Ned found himself alone in the Godswood again, the hush broken only by water trickling in the pool. He gazed at the heart tree's face, remembering how many times he had knelt here, struggling with invisible burdens. At last, he sank to one knee, pressing his palm against the old trunk. "Old gods," he murmured, "grant me wisdom. Whatever comes, let me protect my family and my people. Let the darkness remain only a story." He closed his eyes and heard only the whisper of leaves. The old presence seemed neither comforting nor ominous, merely there. After a while, he stood and left, returning to the castle. A sense of foreboding tugged at him, though he pushed it down. Robert's arrival would bring changes, that much was certain. Perhaps this would lead him far from Winterfell. Perhaps it would expose him to the machinations of the court, the Lannisters, the intrigues of the South. But no matter what happened, Ned Stark carried with him the knowledge of the North's ancient threats. He might leave Winterfell if duty called, but he would never truly leave behind the vow he had made. That if the others ever rose, if the legends proved real, if the dead walked once more in the far north, House Stark would stand against them. He could trace that promise back to a time before Robert's rebellion, when he was just a boy, poring over dusty books in the library, haunted by the name of the Night's King. That knowledge had shaped him, quietly, relentlessly, settling into the foundations of who he was. He had fought wars among men, raised children, and ruled a great house, yet still the old fear lurked at the edges of his conscience, a fear tempered by resolve. As the days neared for Robert's visit, Winterfell bustled in preparation. Servants scrubbed the floors, aired out chambers, and set up extra tents. Scullions toiled in the kitchens, preparing stores of meats and breads for feasts. Musicians practiced in the corners of the great hall. The courtyard filled with the clamor of men erecting pavilions. Theon smirked at the spectacle, remarking how the southern lords would find the north too cold for their liking. Robb supervised the training yard, eager to show the king a strong discipline. Sansa daydreamed of knights and courtly romance. Arya snuck away to practice archery, uninterested in needlework. Bran eyed the towers, perhaps planning a climb to see the royal procession approach. And Ned stood at the gates sometimes, gazing down the long road, thinking of what future might come thundering up that path. Whatever it was, he would face it as he faced all things, steadfast, guided by the words of his house. Winter is coming. They were not just a motto, but a promise of vigilance. If the realm was threatened by the ghosts of ancient legend, Ned Stark would do his duty, even if the rest of Westeros remained blind. He had known too much, suspected too strongly, to ever ignore that possibility. On the morning the king's party arrived, Ned was there to greet them, surrounded by his household. Trumpets blared, and horses stamped. Robert emerged in all his larger-than-life presence, sweeping Ned into a hearty embrace. They exchanged warm words, jokes, memories. The crowd cheered. Hidden beneath that pageantry, a whisper of tension clung to Ned's heart, for he sensed that everything was about to change. But for that moment, he smiled for his friend and for the people who watched. He could not have known that his journey would lead him away from Winterfell to the very heart of the South, and to a fate that would test his honor in ways beyond imagination. Yet even then, in those first moments of Robert's arrival, Ned felt a faint chill that had nothing to do with the northern wind. He saw it in the faint swirl of snow around the courtyard, as though the land itself offered a reminder. Old powers might be stirring, old vows might be tested. Could Ned Stark have known about the Night King before Robert's rebellion? Yes. In a sense, he had carried that seed of knowledge within him for years, nurtured by dusty tomes and by the tragedies that befall the men of the Night's Watch. He did not know the full truth, but he knew enough to suspect that the realm slept while an ancient menace bided its time. Now, Robert Baratheon had come, bearing a new call to duty that would pull Ned south. And so began another chapter of Ned Stark's life, one shaped by politics and secrets, overshadowed by the silent knowledge of a threat that the rest of the realm still believed was merely a tale for winter nights. For Ned Stark, though, that looming presence was never far from his thoughts. In the days to come, as he walked the halls of Winterfell alongside Robert, showing him the crypts and the grandeur of the old keep, Ned would sometimes pause, sensing a breath of cold air. He would think of Benjen, still missing, and the possible horrors that lurked in the far north. He would glance at the heart tree in the Godswood, silent witness to all the ages of House Stark. And he would remember the vow implicit in the Stark words, in his family's legacy, and in the old stories that had shaped his youth. If the darkness ever returned, if the others swept down upon the living, the men of the North would stand firm. The line of the Starks, bound by ancient oaths and ancient blood, would hold the gate against the night. He could not speak of it openly to the king, nor to the southern lords who scoffed at legends. But within Ned Stark's stoic heart, the flame of warning burned bright. For though Robert's rebellion and the Greyjoy rebellion and all the petty wars among men had tested his steel, they were, perhaps, just preludes to a far greater conflict, the one that men had nearly forgotten, the one that simmered beyond mortal sight. Ned prayed that his quiet vigilance would never be needed, that the others would remain a nightmare of the past. Yet every time the wind blew from the north, rustling the trees of the Wolfswood, he found it impossible to ignore the echo of that ancient name, the Night's King. And so he guarded that knowledge, carrying it with him as he walked beside a king who feared only what swords could strike and armies could conquer, never imagining that there were enemies beyond the scope of crowns and blades. That knowledge was Ned's alone, part of the burden he bore for being a Stark, a man of the North. One day, if the worst came to pass, the truth would no longer be hidden. For now, as the trumpets sounded and King Robert laughed in Winterfell's courtyard, Ned Stark could only greet his friend, bow his head, and silently brace himself for the trials to come. Both those wrought by men's ambition and those, far older, wrought by the silent, unrelenting cold.